The forests of western Pennsylvania hold their secrets the way old men hold their grief, quietly, for decades. A dirt road cuts through the pines, barely a road, more like a wound in the earth that never fully healed. At the end of it stands a cabin, weathered silver by 50 winters, its porch tilted by decades of patient waiting. Inside, a woman kneels on the floor, her hands pressed against old pine boards. She is not searching, she is listening. A hollow sound rises beneath her fingertips. She stops. Somewhere behind her, a sealed envelope sits on the table. It was not addressed to her. The man it was meant for has been dead for 2 years. The key inside it opens something she has not yet found. And outside, at the edge of the tree line, a black SUV sits with its engine on, watching. The foreclosure notice from Seashore Bank and Trust had been sitting on Nora Aldridge's kitchen table for 11 days. She had read it twice on the first morning, folded it back into its envelope, and placed it beneath a coffee mug she no longer used. That was her system. If she could not see it, she did not have to make a decision about it yet. But this morning she unfolded it again. 60 days. The number sat on the page without apology. 60 days before the bank would begin proceedings on the house she and Ford had bought with such careful hope 5 years ago, back when hope still felt like a reasonable thing to carry around. She set the notice down and looked at the window. The November light was thin and gray, the kind that made everything look like it was already over. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, not from insomnia, but from the particular arithmetic that kept running through her head. 2 shifts at the gift shop, 41 hours last week. The number at the bottom of her bank statement. The gap between those two figures that no amount of rearranging could close. She heard the bedroom door open. Small feet on hardwood. Then Bea appeared in the doorway, 8 years old and already dressed, her dark hair brushed and pinned back with the clip shaped like a daisy that Ford had given her the Christmas before his accident. She was wearing the black dress. Is this the right one for Grandma Gwen? Nora pushed back from the table and crossed the kitchen. She knelt in front of her daughter and began folding the hem up carefully, just enough to make it look intentional rather than outgrown. Her hands moved the way her mother's hands had once moved on her, practical and gentle at the same time. It is perfect, she said. Come here, let me fix the buttons. Bea stood still while Nora worked. She was a child who had learned early to stand still when adults needed a moment. Mom. Bea's voice was quiet, the way it got when she was working up to something. I wore this for Dad. Now I am wearing it for Great-Grandma Gwen. She paused. When am I going to wear it again? The question hung in the kitchen air, innocent and precise. Nora finished the last button and kept her hands on her daughter's shoulders a moment longer than necessary. We do not have to think about that today, she said. Today we just go and say goodbye. The drive to Pinewood Memorial Gardens took them along the eastern edge of Oak Ridge, a small town in western Pennsylvania where the Pennick family had lived for 3 generations. The roads were empty at that hour, and the November trees stood bare against a white sky, their branches making complicated patterns that reminded Nora of old maps, the kind with edges that fell off into nothing. She had grown up visiting Gwen Pennick in this town, though visits had become rarer and then almost non-existent in the years after Ford died. Not from indifference, from the simple arithmetic of survival. 2 jobs and a child and a house that kept needing things left very little room for anything else, including the guilt she carried about that. The cemetery sat at the top of a gentle hill. The groundskeepers had placed a green canopy over the gravesite, and by the time Nora and Bea arrived, a cluster of dark-clothed figures had already gathered beneath it. She spotted Lyle Pennick immediately, Gwen's son, and the eldest of her 2 surviving children. He was a large man with a broad face and the particular quality of stillness that powerful people develop when they are watching and calculating. Beside him stood his sister Willa, smaller and more careful in her movements, her expression arranged into something that resembled grief but did not quite achieve it. Nora took Bea's hand and walked toward the gathering. She heard Lyle before she reached them. He was not speaking loudly. He was speaking at the volume of a man who wants to be overheard by a specific person. She never visited, not once in the last year. He said it the way people announce things that are simultaneously observations and verdicts. Willa murmured something in response that Nora could not hear. Then Willa looked up and saw Nora approaching, and something shifted in her face, a quick recalibration. The service itself passed the way services do when a person has outlived most of the people who truly knew them. A minister spoke about eternal rest. A few of Gwen's church friends dabbed at their eyes. The grandchildren who had not visited stood solemnly and looked at the middle distance. Bia pressed against Nora's side and watched everything with the particular attention of a child who has already learned that funerals are not really about the person in the ground. It was Bia who noticed the car. She tugged Nora's hand during the final prayer and pointed with her chin toward the road that ran along the base of the cemetery hill. A black SUV sat parked 2 rows back from the other vehicles, engine off, windows slightly lowered. No one had gotten out, no one appeared to be approaching. Nora looked at it for a moment, then looked away. She told herself it was someone waiting for a different service, or someone who had arrived late and felt awkward about joining. She filed it away in the back of her mind the way you file things that do not yet have names. After the burial, as the gathering began to disperse, Willa appeared at Nora's elbow with the smooth efficiency of someone who had planned the approach. "The reading of the will is at 2, she said. "Peterson's office on Main." She paused, and her voice took on a texture of concern that did not reach her eyes. "Of course, you do not really need to be there, sweetheart. Gwen made her wishes quite clear, and most of it is fairly straightforward." Nora looked at her aunt steadily. "I will be there," she said. "Not for money, Aunt Willa. For Gwen." Something moved briefly across Willa's expression, too fast to identify. Then she nodded and turned away, and Nora watched her rejoin Lyle near the cars. They spoke briefly, heads bent together, and then Lyle glanced back in Nora's direction with the particular look of a man reassessing a calculation. Peterson's law office occupied the second floor of Oak Ridge's oldest brick building. The waiting room smelled of furniture polish and old paper, and the leather chairs had been worn to a specific shape by decades of people sitting in them with difficult news. Nora sat with Bia on one side of the room, while Lyle and Willa clustered with their respective families on the other, their voices low and certain in the way of people who already know what they are about to receive. Bia had brought her notebook, a small spiral-bound thing she carried everywhere, and she sat with her legs swinging above the floor and drew careful pictures of the potted plants near the window. Through the half-open door to the inner office, Nora caught fragments of Lyle's voice. Something about property taxes. Something about the cost of maintaining rural land. Something about people who made poor financial decisions and then expected others to compensate for the consequences. She kept her face still and looked at the wall above B's head. Peterson was a thin man with white hair and glasses that moved steadily down his nose throughout the reading, so that he spent half the session pushing them back up. He read through the bequests in order. The jewelry collection to Willa. The antique silver service to a cousin named Margaret. The 2011 Buick to Lyle. A series of smaller items distributed to various relations who had at least maintained the appearance of familial obligation. Then he looked up at Nora over his sliding glasses. "To my granddaughter Nora Aldridge, I leave the property located at 156 Pine Hollow Road, commonly known as the Pennock Cabin, along with all contents therein. The property transfer requires a nominal payment of $1, with all property taxes paid through the end of the current calendar year." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Lyle exhaled a short sound that was almost a laugh. "The cabin," he said. He turned to Willa with the expression of a man whose expectations have been confirmed. Of course she left her the cabin. Willa said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that communicated agreement without requiring commitment. Peterson cleared his throat and slid a cream-colored envelope across the conference table toward Nora. "Your grandmother asked that I give you this privately following the reading," he said. Her instructions were specific on that point. Nora reached out and took the envelope with both hands. Her name was written on the front in Gwen's handwriting, the letters slightly unsteady but unmistakably deliberate. Lyle was already gathering his papers. "Some of us have actual schedules to return to," he said to no one in particular. They left without speaking to Nora or Bia. Not a word of condolence for the loss of a woman Nora had genuinely loved. The door closed behind them, and the room felt different, quieter in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable. Peterson looked at Nora over his displaced glasses. "Take whatever time you need," he said, and excused himself. Nora sat for a moment holding the envelope. Bia climbed into the adjacent chair and leaned against her mother's arm, looking at the writing on the front. "That is Grandma Gwen's handwriting," she said. "Yes, she drew your name really pretty." "Yes, she did." Nora opened the envelope carefully, the way you open things from people who are no longer able to explain what they meant. Inside was a single sheet of Gwen's personal stationery, cream-colored with a small border of blue flowers around the edges. My dearest Nora, this cabin holds more secrets than people realize. When you feel ready, look closely at the floor. Trust no one until you know the whole truth. All my love, Gwen. Below the signature was a small drawing, the kind Gwen had always made in the margins of her letters, quick and precise. A key shape with a five-pointed star at its base. Taped to the bottom of the page was an iron key, old and heavy, its surface dark with age but not with rust. Bee's finger traced the star. What does that mean, Mom? Nora looked at the key, then at the drawing, then at her daughter's face. I do not know yet, she said, but I think we need to go visit this cabin. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and thought about Gwen, about the careful way the old woman had always done things, the way she had arranged even her most casual gestures with a kind of underlying intention. Gwen Pennock was not a woman who sent cryptic notes by accident. She was not a woman who taped keys to letters as decoration. Look closely at the floor. The next morning, Nora called in sick to the gift shop for the first time in 2 years. She packed a bag for herself and Bea with more deliberateness than the overnight trip seemed to require. Flashlight, extra batteries, a set of new padlocks she had purchased at the hardware store on her way home the previous evening, though she could not have explained precisely why. Cleaning supplies, food that did not require refrigeration. Bea put on her rain boots before they left, though the sky was only lightly overcast. Are we going on an adventure, she asked from the passenger seat, bouncing slightly. Something like that, Nora said. We are going to see Grandma Gwen's cabin. It belongs to us now. Bea considered this. Ours like we actually own it. Yes. Can we live there like pioneers? Nora glanced at her. Let us see what we are working with before we start churning butter. The drive took them beyond Oak Ridge's modest boundaries and into increasingly dense forest. The GPS directed them onto a state highway, then a county road, then a gravel path nearly hidden between tall pines. The trees grew close on both sides, their branches meeting overhead in a way that turned the light greenish and cathedral-like even in November. This is like a fairy tale, Bea said, pressing her nose against the window. The houses in the forest are always hidden deep in the trees. The cabin stood at the end of the gravel path, alone at the edge of a clearing. Log walls silvered with age. A covered porch that wrapped around two sides, its roof slightly tilted but intact. Windows grimy but unbroken, reflecting the gray sky back at itself. A stone chimney rising solid from one end. The whole structure had the look of something that had decided to outlast its original purpose and simply kept going. It is smaller than I thought, Bea said. Your great-great-grandfather Flint built it himself, Nora said, after he came home from the war. They ran from the car to the porch through a light drizzle. Nora fumbled with the iron key at the heavy wooden door. It turned with a smoothness that surprised her, as if the mechanism had been recently maintained. The door swung inward with a low, settled sound, the sound of something old but not neglected. Inside, the light was dim and gray. Nora found a wall switch, but nothing happened when she flipped it. She pulled out her flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom to reveal a main room dominated by a stone fireplace. A worn leather sofa faced two armchairs across a wooden table. Dust covered every surface, but there was no sign of mice or water damage, no smell of rot or abandonment. Someone had closed this place up carefully. Mom, look. Bea was pointing at the fireplace mantel. Nora moved the beam of light upward. Framed photographs stood in neat rows along the mantel's length. A young man in military uniform, his expression serious beneath his service cap. A young woman who could only be Gwen, her smile clear and direct. A man in fishing gear who must have been Gwen's husband, James. And at the end of the row, slightly larger than the others, a wedding photograph. Nora recognized her own face, younger by 6 years, Ford standing beside her with his hand at her waist, and that expression he always had in photographs, as if he knew something about the future that he was choosing not to mention. Gwen had kept their wedding photo here. In this private place she had apparently visited over the years, this cabin she had never once mentioned to Nora in all their conversations. Nora stood in front of it for a long moment. On the back of the frame, she found it almost accidentally, her fingers running along the edge before she realized she was looking. A small piece of paper folded once, taped to the wood. She peeled it loose carefully and opened it. Gwen's handwriting, blue ink, one line. Ford already knew. He has been waiting for you to come here. Nora read the sentence 3 times. Ford had never spoken about this place, not once in 6 years. He had been a man of deliberate honesty, a man who returned overpayments and corrected mistakes in his own favor and kept no private accounts. But this she had not known. She folded the note and put it in her pocket. They spent the afternoon exploring and settling in as best they could without electricity. Nora found the breaker box and confirmed what she expected. The main power was off, but there was a generator in the shed behind the cabin. The rain made it impractical to attempt starting it that afternoon. She gathered wood from a covered pile on the porch and got a fire going in the stone fireplace, a task that took longer than she expected but eventually produced something warm and steady. Bea explored every room with systematic thoroughness, reporting back her findings. A kitchen with old appliances but a solid structure. Two bedrooms with hand-sewn quilts on the beds. A bathroom that Gwen had apparently updated at some point, its fixtures modern relative to everything else in the cabin. A bookshelf in the main room filled with a mix of paperback novels, field guides to Pennsylvania birds, and several volumes of history with cracked spines that suggested actual use. They ate sandwiches from the cooler Nora had brought and made nests of blankets near the fireplace as the darkness outside deepened. "Can we look at the floor now?" Bea asked. "What Grandma Gwen said in the letter, tomorrow," Nora said, "when we have better light. But you are thinking about it right now." She was. She had been thinking about it since she read the letter in Peterson's office. She had been thinking about the combination of the letter and the note behind the photograph, the way they fit together into something that was not quite an explanation, but was clearly the beginning of one. She tucked Bea in and sat by the dying fire for a long time, reading through an old field guide she had found on the shelf, not really reading it, but holding it while her mind worked at the question from different angles. The iron key sat on the table beside her. The five-pointed star on Gwen's drawing seemed specific, the kind of specific that meant something rather than simply decorated. Somewhere after midnight she heard it, a sound from the porch. Not wind in the pines, not a branch settling. Footsteps, deliberate weight on old wood moving slowly along the front of the cabin. She set down the field guide without making any noise and stood. Her hand closed around the fireplace poker, and she moved toward the front door. The footsteps circled to the side of the cabin. Then came a different sound, metal against glass, a careful and persistent scraping. Someone testing a window, not frantically but methodically, the way a person works when they have time and patience and a specific objective. Nora stood in the dark with the poker and thought through her options. The phone in her pocket had no signal this far from town. The generator was off. Bea was asleep in the back bedroom. Then the scraping stopped. A car engine started somewhere down the gravel road, distant at first, and then receding entirely. She waited 10 minutes by the clock on her phone, moving from window to window and listening. Nothing. Whoever had been there was gone, but they had been there. And they had known somehow that the cabin was occupied. The electricity was off. She had not turned on any lights. The car she had parked in the clearing was visible from the road, but that would only matter to someone who already knew to look. She did not sleep again that night. Morning came with sunlight and birdsong, and the particular quality of after-rain air in pine forests, clean and sharp in a way that made the previous night seem remote. Bea awoke cheerful and immediately purposeful. "Can we look at the floor now?" "After breakfast," Nora said. They ate granola bars and bottled water from the cooler. Then Nora began a slow and systematic inspection of the main room's wooden floor. The planks were wide pine boards, darkened by decades of use, solid throughout most of the room. She knocked on them methodically, working from the south wall toward the north, listening for changes in resonance. Bea followed behind her, playing the same knocking game. It was Bea who found it. She was moving along the north wall, her knuckles rapping against each board in sequence, when her hands stopped. "Mom." She rapped again, then on the adjacent board, then back. "Listen." Nora knelt beside her and knocked. The difference was immediate and unmistakable. A hollow sound where everything else had been solid, a space beneath suggesting a room, or at minimum a significant void. "Good ear, sweetheart." She ran her fingers along the boards in the area, pressing and probing. After several minutes, she found an almost invisible seam forming a rectangle, roughly 3 feet by 4, the edges so skillfully fitted that they disappeared entirely until you knew to look for them. No handle, no hinge, no obvious mechanism. She sat back on her heels and thought about the drawing. The key with the star at its base. She retrieved the iron key from the table and examined the bow end more carefully. There, small but definite, a 5-pointed star, part of the key's design rather than added to it. She stood and began examining the baseboard along the north wall, running her fingers along the bottom edge, feeling for variations. She was moving an armchair away from the wall to access a section she could not reach when her hand found it. A small star carved directly into the wood, perhaps an inch across, at the exact height of the baseboard. She pressed the area around it, experimentally. A small panel shifted, depressed slightly, and popped open to reveal a keyhole behind it. Nora inserted the iron key and turned it. A soft, definitive click sounded in the quiet room. She pushed on the rectangular section of flooring. It lifted slightly. She got her fingers underneath and raised it fully. Below was darkness and the top of a narrow wooden staircase descending into stone and earth. A smell rose up from the opening, not unpleasant, just deeply old. The smell of enclosed spaces that had been waiting. Bia appeared at her shoulder. A secret basement, she whispered, like in the fairy tales. Not a dungeon, Nora said. People used to build cellars for food storage, but this seems different. She descended first, testing each step carefully. At the bottom, her flashlight revealed a space roughly 15 feet square, stone walls, packed earth floor, the whole structure clearly deliberate and carefully built. Along one wall ran shelves built floor to ceiling. Display cases sat on two of them. Boxes, some wooden, some wrapped in cloth, occupied the others, each one labeled in handwriting that Nora was beginning to recognize as Flint Pennock's precise masculine script. Beside the stairs sat a wooden crate, and on top of it, a battery-powered lantern. Small, modern. Its batteries, when Nora switched it on, were fresh. Someone had been here recently, not decades recently. The warm light filled the room and showed them everything. Nora moved to the nearest shelf and examined a glass-topped case. Inside lay rows of coins in protective holders, each with a small handwritten tag. The dates she could read ranged from the 1800s to the mid-20th century. American coins and foreign ones, German, French, British, others she could not immediately identify. Bia moved along the adjacent shelving to a case of military medals and insignia arranged in velvet-lined rows. "Are these from wars?" she asked. "I think so." Nora opened one of the leather-bound ledgers on the desk in the corner. The handwriting was Gwen's. The title page read, "Continuation of Flint Pennock's Collection Registry, Volume 12, 1987. The pages detailed each item in precise order, its origin, its history, its condition, and its significance. Some entries were clinical in tone. Others contained notes that read more like eulogies than catalog entries. A French franc given to Flint by a baker in Normandy after Flint shared his rations with the baker's children. A campaign button from Lincoln's second presidential run, museum quality condition, purchased at a Boston coin show in 1992. The oldest ledger had a cover cracked with age, its binding separating at the spine. Flint's handwriting inside was younger and darker than in the later volumes. The first page read, "I begin this record on the day of my return home. These items are not trophies. They are memories of places and people and promises. Each one represents a life that was touched by war. Many of those lives are now extinguished. I collect not for value but for remembrance. When memory fails, as it surely will, these objects will speak of what we endured and what we lost." Nora read the passage twice. "Your great-great-grandfather was trying to preserve history," she said to Bea. "Not facts and dates, the stories of real people." She turned pages slowly. A 1947 entry, a 1953 entry, a 1968 entry, each one a careful record of a new acquisition and the human story behind it. The scope of what Flint had assembled across half a century became gradually apparent. Then, inserted loosely between two pages near the back of the oldest ledger, she found it. A small envelope, cream-colored, the kind Gwen used for personal correspondence, addressed in Gwen's handwriting. Not to Nora, to Ford Alcott. The envelope was sealed. The adhesive was still firm. Ford had never received this letter. Nora held it in both hands for a long time without moving. Beside the address, tucked under the flap rather than inside it, she found a small key she had not seen before. Unlike the iron key in any way, smaller and more modern. The kind that opened a specific lock rather than a general one. She had no idea what it opened. Bea was watching her from across the room. "Is that for Dad?" she asked. Nora looked at her daughter's face. "Yes," she said carefully. "It was meant for him, but he never got it." The lantern's light was steady and warm in the underground room. Outside, through the stone walls and the earth above them, the November forest was quiet. Nora sat with the sealed envelope in her hands and felt the weight of it, not physical weight, but the other kind, the kind that accumulates around things that have been held back too long. She put it in her pocket without opening it. She was not ready yet. Not here, not now, not without understanding more of what she was holding. She put the small key on her key ring alongside the iron key and began photographing the room systematically with her phone, moving shelf by shelf, case by case, working with the quiet purpose of someone who has understood that what surrounds them is serious and must be treated seriously. They were going home tonight, she had decided. They needed proper supplies, proper security, and she needed to find the number she had seen written in the margin of one of Gwen's ledger entries. Rex Lassiter, with a Pittsburgh area code and the notation, verbal estimate indicates full collection value approaching 2 to 3 million, verbal only, not for file. She had read that notation 3 times before the number settled fully in her mind. Not the cabin, not the 5 acres of woodland, the contents of the room she was standing in. She climbed the stairs and pulled B up behind her, secured the trap door, replaced the armchair over the hidden panel. The lantern she left below, switched off but in its place. "This is our secret for now," she told Bia. "Like spies with classified information," B said solemnly. "Exactly like that." They packed their overnight bags and carried them to the car in the fading afternoon light. Nora was lowering the cooler into the trunk when her phone rang. The signal was weak but apparently sufficient. The caller ID showed Willa Pennick. She answered it. Willa's voice carried none of its usual careful smoothness. "Nora," she said, "I am glad I reached you. I was calling to check whether you had gone out to look at the cabin yet." Nora stood very still beside her car. "Yes," she said, "we came out yesterday." A pause, just a fraction of a beat too long. "I thought you might have," Willa said. "Listen, sweetheart, I just want you to know that there are some family documents that Gwen kept out there. Old papers that really belong to all of us. Lyle and I would love to come by and collect them when it is convenient." "What kind of documents, Willa?" "Oh, just business records. Old deeds, family history things. Nothing important, really, but sentimental to us." "Today is not a good time," Nora said. "We are heading back to town now." Willa's voice tightened slightly beneath its warmth. "We would not be in your way at all. We could come in an hour or so. I will let you know when I have had time to look through things properly." Nora ended the call before Willa could respond. She stood beside the car for a moment longer, looking at the cabin. The iron key was in her pocket, alongside the sealed envelope addressed to Ford. The small key on her key ring still had no door it fit. Someone had been walking this porch last night. Someone knew they were here. And Willa Pennick, who had no reason to know they had driven out to Pine Hollow Road the previous afternoon, had just called to ask if they had. Nora got into the car. Bia was already in her seat, seatbelt buckled. "Who is that?" Bia asked. "Your great-aunt Willa," Nora said. "She wants to visit the cabin." She put the car in reverse. In the rearview mirror, the cabin stood at the edge of the clearing, its weathered logs absorbing the last of the afternoon light. "She wanted to know if we had already been here," Nora said, more to herself than to Bia. "But we did not tell anyone we were coming." Bia was quiet for a moment. "So how did she know?" That, Nora said, was exactly the right question. Rex Lassiter's blue pickup was already in the clearing when Nora turned onto Pine Hollow Road the following morning. She had called him from town the previous evening, standing in her kitchen with a sealed envelope on the table in front of her and the sound of Bia sleep down the hall. The phone had rung 3 times. Then a voice gravel and deliberate. Lassiter. She had given her name. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped before he spoke again. "I have been waiting for this call," he said. "Gwen told me someone would reach out eventually. I did not think it would be this soon after she passed." He had agreed to come the next morning without asking a single question about what she had found. That alone told her something. He was standing on the porch when she parked, a man somewhere past 70 with white hair and the kind of physical stillness that comes from decades of working carefully with fragile things. He wore a worn denim jacket and carried a leather satchel over one shoulder. When he turned, she saw that he had hearing aids barely visible beneath silver sideburns, and that his eyes, pale blue and sharp, assessed her with the same practiced attention she imagined he gave everything. "You look like Gwen around the eyes," he said, extending his hand. "She always said you had the Pennick stubbornness." He glanced down at Bia, who had already climbed out of the car and was regarding him with frank appraisal. And this must be Bia. Bia shook his hand with both of hers, which was something she only did when she had decided to take someone seriously. "I am Bia Alcott," she said. "Do you know what is in the basement?" Rex looked at Nora. "Yes," he said. "I help maintain most of it." He moved through the cabin without hesitation, heading directly for the north wall and the armchair Nora had replaced over the hidden panel. He moved the chair himself with the ease of someone who had done it many times and nodded when Nora used the iron key to open the panel and then the trap door. "Good," he said. "You figured out the mechanism. Gwen insisted on something a locksmith would not immediately recognize. She had a very particular mind about security. They descended into the underground room, and Rex set his satchel on the desk and began moving along the shelves with a slowness that was not age but reverence. He paused at each case, each labeled box, each cloth-wrapped bundle, touching nothing but looking at everything with the attention of a man reacquainting himself with something he cared about. The Mercury Dime series, he said, stopping before a long glass-topped case, nearly complete, all in remarkable condition. Flint had an extraordinary eye for quality. He held his flashlight at an angle to illuminate a coin dated 1916 and this campaign button from Lincoln's second run. That is museum quality, Nora. Not gift shop museum, Smithsonian Museum. How did Flint afford any of this? Nora asked. From what I understand, he worked as a machinist after the war. Rex set down his light and turned to face her. That is the part most people would never guess. He did not buy the majority of these pieces outright. He traded skills, services, time. He fixed things for people who had historical items collecting dust in their attics and their barns. He repaired a widow's tractor engine and received a complete set of Civil War currency in return. He rebuilt a veteran's truck and came away with a collection of World War I service medals. He spent 50 years building relationships with other collectors and with families who had things they could not identify or did not know how to value. This collection represents half a century of those exchanges, not deep pockets, deep patience and deeper respect. Nora stood very still while he spoke. She had been trying to understand Flint Pennock from his journal entries, from the careful ledger notations, from the objects themselves. This piece, the method behind the accumulation, shifted something in her understanding of the man. Rex continued his assessment for the better part of an hour, making occasional notes in a small leather-bound book he produced from his satchel. He stopped at a section of the shelving dedicated to military decorations arranged in chronological order across several cases. This portion alone would interest any serious military museum in the country, he said. The provenance documentation is impeccable. Flint kept records that most professional curators would envy. Nora had been dreading the question, but asked it anyway. What is it worth? The whole collection. Rex removed his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief, which she was beginning to understand was something he did when he was choosing his words precisely. Conservatively, the full collection approaches $3 million, possibly higher depending on the current market for specific categories. He replaced his glasses and looked at her directly. But I want you to understand something before that number settles in your head. Breaking this collection apart would destroy a significant portion of its value, both monetary and historical. Flint spent 50 years creating something that is greater than the sum of its parts. The relationships between these objects, the documented connections between them, that is what elevates this from a valuable collection to a historically significant archive. Sell it piece by piece, and you have a lot of individually interesting items. Keep it intact, and you have something irreplaceable. Bia, who had been moving quietly along the shelves this whole time, spoke without looking up from the case she was examining. So the stories are worth more than the stuff. Rex looked at her. That is correct, he said. That is exactly correct. Nora was still processing the number. $3 million. She thought about the foreclosure notice on her kitchen table. She thought about the 2 jobs. She thought about Bia in the outgrown black dress. Lyle approached Gwen 5 years ago, Rex said, his voice shifting to a different register. Brought in his own appraiser, someone who undervalued the collection by more than half. He wanted her to sell. She refused. He then suggested she might not be mentally competent to make that decision herself. He tried to have her declared incompetent. He did. Gwen was tougher than he expected. She documented everything, updated her will to name you as sole inheritor, and made sure that Sheriff Hartwell was aware the property needed watching. She also contacted me and asked me to prepare a full independent appraisal on record with a historical preservation organization in Pittsburgh, in case it was ever needed in court. Nora heard the sound of tires on the gravel outside before anyone else did. She was closest to the small window set high in the stone wall, grimy with decades of accumulated dust, and she moved to it and wiped a small circle with her palm. A county sheriff's department vehicle was pulling into the clearing beside her own car. That will be Clint Hartwell, Rex said, already moving toward the stairs. I called him this morning. I thought you could use another ally on the ground. Sheriff Clint Hartwell was younger than Nora had imagined from the name, Late 50s with salt and pepper hair cut close and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his working hours outside. He removed his hat when he entered the cabin and introduced himself with a handshake that was brief and firm. "Your grandmother spoke well of you," he said. "She called me every time she came out here alone. Said she liked having someone with a badge know where she was. You knew about the collection?" "Knew there was something worth protecting. She never specified what." He paused, though I had my suspicions after the business with Lyle 5 years back. He came down into the hidden room and stood for a moment taking it in with the particular expression of a man who has spent decades preparing for surprises and still occasionally meets one. "Been patrolling this road for years without knowing what was down here," he said. "Gwen just said it was family history that needed safeguarding." He listened while Nora described the previous night, the footsteps on the porch, the sound of metal against the window glass, the car that started and drove away. His expression did not change while she spoke, but something behind it sharpened. "Not surprised," he said when she finished. "Lyle has been at the county records office 3 times in the past 2 months, pulling property surveys, mineral rights filings, anything related to parcels in this valley." He paused. "There is a development group, Oak Ridge Valley Partners, that has been buying up land out here for the past 18 months, planning a private resort community on the ridge. Your grandmother's 5 acres is a piece they need to complete the southern boundary of their planned acquisition." Nora felt the shape of it assembling in her mind. "He does not just want the collection. He wants the land," Hartwell confirmed. "The collection is a bonus, a very significant bonus. But the primary objective for Oak Ridge Valley Partners is the property itself." He reached into the leather bag he had carried in and produced a manila folder. Inside were printed photographs, time-stamped in the lower corner, camera images from a traffic monitoring system on Highway 16, a black SUV visible in 3 sequential frames, its front end partially obscured but its direction clear, following the county road that led toward Pine Hollow. Nora recognized the vehicle before he told her. The same one she had seen parked outside the cemetery, engine running, windows cracked. "That plate is registered to a shell company," Hartwell said. "The registered address is a mailbox service in Pittsburgh. But the building where that mailbox service operates is the same building where Oak Ridge Valley Partners maintains its primary office." They had been watching her since the funeral. Before she had opened the envelope, before she had driven out to the cabin, before she had found the hidden room or read a single page of Flint's ledgers, they had already been positioned and ready. "Someone told them about the will," she said. "Someone was at that reading," Hartwell agreed, "and that someone made a phone call very quickly afterward." Nora thought about Willa's face during the reading, the careful blankness of it, the small movement at the corner of her mouth when Lyle laughed at the cabin bequest. They spent the rest of the morning working. Hartwell installed new deadbolts on the front and back doors using hardware from the kit he had brought. Rex went through the underground rooms systematically, photographing each piece with a camera that was significantly more sophisticated than Nora's phone, making detailed notes in his leather book. Bea, deciding she had a role to play, appointed herself Rex's assistant and stood beside him, holding his flashlight at whatever angle he indicated. Around midday, Bea tugged at Nora's sleeve and pointed toward the back of the cabin. "There is a path," she said. "I saw it from the window of the little bedroom. It goes into the trees." Nora followed her daughter out through the back door and around the side of the cabin to where a narrow trail emerged from the tree line, barely visible, half overgrown with brush and partially blocked by a fallen branch. It had not been used in years. Hartwell, who had followed them out, studied the path with professional interest. "That heads northeast," he said, "toward the ridge. Should connect eventually to the old logging roads up top." "Is it on the property?" "According to county records, everything within roughly 5 acres of the cabin footprint is Pennock land. But," he paused, "there may be more. I found a reference in the historical deed records to a secondary parcel, separately registered, that this one to the north and east, closer to 10 additional acres. It did not show up in the main deed search because it was filed under a different registration year. 10 more acres, possibly 15 total. I need to pull the original document to be certain, but if what I am reading is correct, Gwen's estate included significantly more land than the will explicitly described." They followed the path single file, Hartwell in front, Then Nora, then Bia, who had found a stick and was using it to clear brush with great enthusiasm. The trail wound through dense pines for roughly half a mile before opening into a small clearing. In its center, partially reclaimed by grass and low vegetation, stood the remnants of a stone foundation, a rectangular outline perhaps 20 by 30 feet, its stones settled and thick with moss but still clearly deliberate, still clearly the bones of something that had once been a building. Another cabin, Nora said. Older than the current one, Hartwell said. These foundation stones look late 18th century from the construction style. This was the original Pennock homestead, most likely. Flint's father probably built the current cabin when the original became too deteriorated to repair. Bia had already begun exploring the ruins, moving carefully along the outer edges and peering into the spaces between stones. She stopped at a section where part of the foundation had collapsed inward, creating an opening that dropped into darkness. "Mom," she called, "there is something underneath." Hartwell produced a flashlight and knelt at the opening. The beam revealed rough stone walls and a packed earth floor perhaps 6 feet below. "A root cellar," he said, "or something like one." He moved the light slowly. There was something down there. The beam caught the edge of a metal box, partially obscured by fallen dirt and the accumulated debris of decades. With Hartwell's help, Nora climbed down through the opening into the space below. The smell was different from the hidden room under the cabin, rawer, more organic, the smell of earth rather than enclosed stone. The box was military, a footlocker with a hasp lock long since rusted through, stenciled on the lid in faded paint. F. Pennock. They hauled it up to the surface between them. The lid opened with resistance and then gave way to reveal contents wrapped carefully in oilcloth, the wrapping still largely intact despite the years. Inside, 3 notebooks with worn covers, a rolled map secured with a deteriorated rubber band that crumbled when touched, bundled letters tied with ribbon that had once been blue. "Flint's personal papers," Nora said, lifting one of the notebooks with both hands. Hartwell was already unrolling the map with the careful hands of someone experienced with fragile documents. He spread it on a flat section of foundation stone and held the corners down. It was hand-drawn on yellowed paper, detailed and precise in the way of someone who had surveyed the land on foot and recorded what he found. Both cabin locations were marked, connected by the path they had just walked. The surrounding acreage was outlined and subdivided. In the northeast corner, near a feature marked as Ridge Lookout, a small star had been added, and beside it in Flint's handwriting, V, best view of the valley, V for Veda, his wife. Hartwell pointed to a notation near the original cabin site. "Secondary storage secured 1963, he read. He looked at Nora. They checked the foundation more carefully this time, working methodically around the perimeter. 15 minutes in, Hartwell found it, a section of poured concrete, slightly lower than the surrounding stonework and distinguished from it by its uniform texture. Set into its center was a rusted metal ring. "Hidden access," he said. "Same designer, different location." It took the combined effort of both of them to shift the concrete slab. Beneath, stone stairs descending into a space smaller than the room under the main cabin, but constructed with the same deliberate care. Stone-reinforced walls, a ceiling braced against the earth above it, shelving along one side. Where the underground room in the cabin held Flint's collected historical archive, this space held something else entirely. Photograph albums. A cedar chest that, when Nora lifted its lid, revealed a wedding dress preserved in layers of tissue paper, still white after all the decades. Flint's military uniforms folded with the precision of a man who had been trained to fold things precisely. Family Bibles, ranging in age from what appeared to be mid-19th century to mid-20th. Toys and school papers and the accumulated documentation of a family across multiple generations. "The Pennock family archive," Hartwell said quietly. Bia came down the stairs and stood at the bottom, looking around without touching anything. "This is all the personal stuff," she said. "The other room is for history. This one is for the family." She was not wrong. The distinction was clear once she named it. Nora opened the last photo album she found on the shelf. The earlier pages contained images of Flint and Veda as young people, their children growing through the decades, family gatherings at the cabin. Gwen appeared throughout, from infancy onward, often beside her father as he examined something he had acquired, her expression in those images attentive and learning. Then the later pages, more recent photographs added by a different hand, the adhesive corners newer and the paper less yellowed. Ford and Gwen together at the main cabin. Seated at the wooden table, both leaning forward over an open ledger, Ford's finger on a specific entry while Gwen pointed to something adjacent. Another image, Ford holding one of the earliest journals with both hands, reading, while Gwen watched him with the expression of a person watching someone understand something important for the first time. The photographs were from 2018, 3 years before Ford's accident. He had described those weekends as fishing trips with friends from work. Gwen's handwriting below the final photograph, in pencil small and precise. Ford is ready. He understands the keeper's obligation. I plan to tell Nora alongside him. God made other arrangements. Nora stood in the cold underground room and read those two sentences until they stopped being words and became something else. Ford had not kept this secret to exclude her. He had been waiting to share it with her, waiting for what Gwen considered the right moment, waiting to stand beside his wife when she learned what her family had built and preserved across the generations. The right moment never came. A factory accident on a Tuesday morning had made sure of that. For the first time since finding the envelope addressed to Ford, Nora felt the grief of his absence not as a wound she was accustomed to managing, but as something acute and specific he had known. He had sat in this cabin and held these journals and understood what they meant. He had been keeping a gift for her, not a secret from her. The difference between those two things was small and enormous at the same time. She realized Bea was beside her. Her daughter's hand slipped into hers without comment or question. They stood that way for a moment in the underground archive while Hartwell gave them space and pretended to examine the shelving on the far wall. They carried Flint's footlocker back to the main cabin, along with the map and the bundled letters. Rex examined the map's contents with the careful attention he brought to everything in the collection, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking Nora a question she could not yet answer. Evening was approaching when Hartwell finished enforcing the cabin's physical security. Motion-activated lights around the perimeter, their sensors mounted high on the porch posts, additional locks on the interior panel covering the trap door. He had also, Nora noticed, positioned himself between the clearing and the tree line for most of the afternoon in a way that was not accidental. He and Rex were preparing to leave when a sound came from the gravel road, a single vehicle moving slowly without headlights. It stopped at the edge of the clearing rather than pulling in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure got out of the passenger side and walked toward the cabin with the deliberate ease of someone who had rehearsed the approach. Earl Pennock was 24 years old and had his father's broad forehead and none of his father's practiced patience. He crossed the clearing with his hands in his jacket pockets and a smile that was three-quarters affable and one-quarter something else. "Hey," he said, looking at Nora. "You must be my cousin, Nora, right? I am Earl, Lyle's son." He said it as though this established something friendly between them. "Dad thought maybe you could use some help out here, the place being so old and all." Nora said nothing. She was looking at his hands, still in his pockets, and at the set of his shoulders, which was not the posture of someone offering assistance. Hartwell stepped forward from the porch. "Earl," he said in the flat voice of a man who does not need to raise it, "you are on private property without an invitation." Earl's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "I was just stopping to say hello, Sheriff. You said hello." Hartwell held the silence for a moment. Earl held it back, then decided not to, turned, and walked back to the waiting vehicle. It reversed up the gravel road without turning around, which meant the driver had never intended to come all the way in. After both vehicles were gone, Hartwell looked at Nora. "Earl has 2 prior arrests," he said, "both breaking and entering, both in the past 3 years. He is not here to be helpful." Nora watched the place where the gravel road disappeared into the trees. She understood what the visit had actually been. An assessment. How many people were present, what the security situation looked like, whether the cabin could be approached and entered without difficulty. They were running reconnaissance. Rex and Hartwell left together just before dark after Nora had confirmed she and Bea would be staying at the cabin overnight. She had the new deadbolts, she had the motion lights, she had Hartwell's direct cell number and his assurance that he would be doing extra passes along Pine Hollow Road. She and Bea ate dinner and did not talk much. Bea sensed the shift in atmosphere the way children do, accurately and without needing it explained. After Bea was asleep in the smaller bedroom, Nora sat at the wooden table in the main room and opened the oldest of Flint's personal notebooks, the ones from the footlocker, not the collection ledgers but his private writing. The early entries were from 1945 and 1946. A man trying to find the language for what he had seen and done and survived. Each object anchors me when the memories try to drag me back, he wrote in an entry dated spring of 1947. I hold something real, something with documented history, and I remember that the world continues despite what human beings are capable of doing to each other. Around midnight, Bea appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. She was barefoot and wearing her flannel pajamas, and she was carrying the small notebook she used for drawing. I could not sleep, she said. I heard you turn pages. Come sit with me. She came and sat across from Nora at the table. She opened her notebook and showed Nora what she had been drawing in the bedroom. Careful, slightly wobbly copies of the coins and medals she had seen in the underground room, each one labeled with what she remembered about them. Names and dates mostly wrong, but the effort precise. I am making my own registry, she said, like great-great-grandpa Flint. Nora looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking. Then she heard the engine. No headlights visible through the windows. The sound came from somewhere down the gravel road, moving slowly, then stopping. Then nothing for several minutes. She put her hand on Bea's arm. Go to the bedroom, she said quietly. Lock the door and do not come out until I come for you. Bea looked at her face and went without argument. Two lights appeared outside, not headlights. Flashlight beams moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, approaching from different angles, the kind of approach that speaks of planning rather than accident. The motion lights on the porch blazed on. In the sudden illumination, Nora saw, for approximately 3 seconds, two figures caught mid-stride in the clearing. One she recognized, Earl, his face briefly visible before he turned away from the light. The other was a larger man she did not know, carrying a bag over one shoulder that clinked softly as he moved. The lights timed out and the darkness returned. She heard them on the porch. The new deadbolt held initially, but she could hear the professional persistence of someone working a tool into the mechanism with experience and patience. She went to the hidden panel, opened it, unlocked the trap door, and descended just far enough to lift Bea down. She set her daughter on the stairs and put both hands on her daughter's face. Stay here, she said, in the room at the bottom. Do not make any sound. I will come back for you. Bea's eyes were wide and very steady. She nodded. Nora went back up the stairs. She went to Gwen's bedroom closet, which Hartwell had opened that afternoon to show her what he found there. An old Winchester shotgun, well-maintained, locked in a cabinet whose key Gwen had kept on a hook inside the closet door. She loaded it the way Hartwell had briefly shown her, her hands not quite steady but functional. She heard the front door give way. Earl's voice, inside the cabin now, low but audible. Dad said it is in the floor near the north wall. Start there. The other man was already moving furniture. Dad said. Lyle had given them the location. Lyle knew about the trap door, which meant Lyle had known about the hidden room for some time, perhaps much longer than 5 years. The sound of the trapdoor being discovered, the armchair dragged aside, the star panel being found and the keyhole identified. A tool working at the lock Hartwell had installed that afternoon. The lock held. The tool worked harder. Nora descended the stairs to the underground room. Bea was pressed against the far wall with Flint's oldest journal clutched to her chest. They found it, Nora said. They are trying to break through. Then she saw what Bea was already pointing at. On the wall opposite the stairs, almost invisible against the stone, a narrow door. She had noticed it during the first exploration and assumed it was a utility access or storage closet. Now, looking at it with the understanding of a man who had built an escape route into his personal archive, she understood what it actually was. The same door, the same thinking. Flint Pennock had built both underground rooms with the same precaution. She crossed to it. The lock was stiff with decades of disuse, but it yielded under sustained pressure. Beyond, a passage barely wide enough for an adult, its ceiling low, its walls shifting from stone to packed earth as it extended away from the room's foundation. She went back for Bea. She gathered the sealed envelope from her jacket pocket, Flint's personal notebooks from the shelf, and Gwen's legal documents from the folder she had brought down earlier that afternoon. Take the flashlight, she told Bea. We are using the other way out. The tunnel ran approximately 30 feet before ending at the base of a vertical shaft. Crude ladder rungs were set into the earth wall, old but solid when tested. She went first. At the top, a wooden hatch weighted from above, resisted, and then surrendered under her shoulder. The hatch emerged behind the woodshed. She helped Bea out and pulled the hatch closed, rearranging the cut firewood that had covered it. From their position in the shadow of the shed, they could see flashlight beams moving through the cabin windows. Earl and his partner had not yet broken through to the underground room, but they would. The forest path was the only option that kept them away from the motion-activated lights on the porch. Nora took Bee's hand and they went into the trees. They ran until Bee could not run anymore. It was not far, perhaps a quarter-mile into the trees, before Bee's legs simply stopped cooperating. She went down to one knee on the pine needle floor and pressed a hand against her side, breathing hard. Nora pulled her up and half-carried her behind a thicket of young pines grown so close together their lower branches formed a wall. She held Bea against her and listened. Behind them, through the trees, the motion lights on the cabin porch flashed on and off as Earl and his partner moved around the clearing. Voices carried in fragments, but not clearly enough to decode, a door slamming. Then the particular sound of the underground room being accessed, which meant the lock on the interior panel had finally given way. Bea's breathing slowed. She did not cry. This was something Nora had noticed about her daughter in the 2 years since Ford's death, the way she had developed a capacity for fear that did not translate into noise. She experienced it and contained it, and waited for it to become something actionable. They kept moving, slower now, picking their way through the dark by the thin moonlight filtering through the canopy. Nora had the flashlight but did not use it. The path to the original foundation was familiar enough from that afternoon, and light would make them visible long before they arrived. The clearing opened ahead of them. The crumbled stone foundation sat in the moonlight, its moss-covered walls silver and motionless. Nora found the concrete slab, found the rusted ring, and she and Bay together managed to shift it enough to open the space below. They descended into the second archive, pulled the slab back into place above them, and sat in absolute darkness on the packed earth floor. Nora switched on the flashlight at its lowest setting. Bea leaned against her and for a long time said nothing. Then, very quietly, "Mom, if Dad knew about all of this and was waiting to tell you." She stopped and started again. He was keeping it like a present, not like a secret. "Yes," Nora said, "that is exactly what he was doing." Bea considered this. "Okay," she said, and seemed to mean it. They stayed in the dark for what Nora estimated was 3 hours, listening to the forest above them settle back into its ordinary sounds. At some point, Bea fell asleep against her shoulder. Nora stayed awake with the sealed envelope in her jacket pocket and the small key on her key ring and Flint's oldest notebook open across her knees, reading by flashlight until the battery began to dim. The early light came as a pale line around the edges of the concrete slab. Nora woke Bea gently. They emerged into a morning that smelled of frost and pine resin, the clearing around the old foundation entirely undisturbed. Whatever search Earl and his partner had conducted had not extended this far into the property. The cabin came into view through the trees, and Nora stopped at the forest edge to assess it before they approached. No vehicles in the clearing, no movement on the porch. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging in the morning air. She told Bea to stay at the tree line and went forward alone. The main room had been systematically ransacked. Furniture overturned, shelves cleared, cabinet doors standing open. The armchair that had concealed the hidden panel was on its side near the fireplace. The trap door stood fully open. She descended and surveyed what remained. The display cases along the wall were broken, their glass pushed inward. Several were empty. Others had been roughly sorted through, their contents jumbled. She worked quickly through the damage, comparing what she could see against her mental inventory from Rex's assessment. The Mercury Dime series, nearly complete and the most immediately liquid item in the collection, was gone. Several of the World War II medals from the central cases were missing. The Civil War currency from the locked cabinet in the corner, forced open and emptied. They had brought a list, Lyle's list, built from knowledge he had accumulated over years of paying attention to a mother who did not know she was being studied. She came back up the stairs and signaled Bea. Her daughter crossed the clearing and stood in the wrecked main room and looked at the overturned furniture and the broken glass with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but something that contained elements of both. "They broke great-grandpa's cases," she said. "We will fix it," Nora told her. "Everything that can be fixed, we will fix." She called Hartwell. He arrived in 18 minutes with 2 deputies and the particular focused quiet of a man who had been half expecting this call. "Earl's prints are going to be all over this room," he said, moving through the space with practiced efficiency. "His partner, if it is who I think it is, has a known associate who moves stolen collectibles through private auction channels in Pittsburgh, fast and quiet. These items could be in different hands within 48 hours if we do not get ahead of it. Can you recover them? His expression was not encouraging but not hopeless. We will try. I have already been in contact with a colleague at the State Police Antique Theft Unit. The Mercury dimes are distinctive enough to flag at major auction platforms. He paused, but proving Lyle's direct involvement is the harder problem. Earl will accept a plea rather than name his father. That is how these family arrangements work. Nora was looking at the broken display case nearest the desk, the one that had held the row of World War I service medals. One had been left behind, knocked to the floor, and apparently overlooked, a single bronze cross still in its velvet backing. She picked it up carefully and set it on the desk. Then Willa arrived. She came in her own car, alone, and she stood in the doorway of the ransacked main room for a long moment before she spoke. Her face was doing something unfamiliar, the careful composure she usually maintained, displaced by an expression that looked, for the first time in Nora's experience of her, genuinely unguarded. I did not know he would do this, she said. Nora looked at her steadily and said nothing. Willa came further into the room. She stepped around a toppled bookshelf and stood near the open trapdoor and looked down into the underground room below. Lyle described it to me once. He said he had seen references to it in some of Gwen's correspondence years ago. I did not know he had told Earl where to look. You told him we were at the cabin after the first night, Nora said. Willa did not deny it. I made a phone call I should not have made. She said it plainly, without the layered qualifications she usually wrapped around difficult admissions. He told me he only wanted to establish whether the property was occupied, that he would deal with the legal aspects through proper channels. Hartwell was listening from across the room without appearing to listen. He showed me the development agreement last year, Willa continued. Oak Ridge Valley Partners. He said the land sale would benefit the whole family, that Gwen's refusal to engage was costing all of us an opportunity. I believed him because it was easier to believe him. She paused. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation and not a good one. Nora looked at her aunt, this woman who had sat across a table at the will reading and made a remark about Gwen's age and questionable judgment, and tried to locate the specific quality in her face that would help determine whether this moment was genuine or tactical. She found something that resembled genuine. Whether it was enough was a different question. Willa reached into her bag and produced two items which she held out toward Nora. A manila folder and a sealed envelope with the seal of a Pittsburgh medical practice on the front flap. Property transfer documents for the 10 additional acres, she said, nodding at the folder, and Gwen's neurological evaluation from last March. She arranged it herself when she understood Lyle would try to challenge her competence. The specialist confirmed she was fully sharp. Gwen wanted this kept safe outside the house. Nora took both items. Why are you doing this now? She asked. Willa was quiet for a moment. I visited Gwen every Sunday for the last 5 years of her life. She told me about Flint constantly. Not about the collection's value, never that specifically, but about his philosophy. About the idea that objects carry the stories of the people who held them, and that letting those stories disappear is its own kind of loss. She looked at the underground room through the open trapdoor. I understood what she was saying. I understood it, and I still let Lyle persuade me that the practical considerations outweighed it. She met Nora's eyes. I was wrong, and I do not expect you to forgive that quickly or easily, but I will not compound it further. After Willa left, Hartwell looked at Nora across the wrecked room. That neurological evaluation confirms Gwen's competence on the record, he said. Combined with the property transfer, this significantly strengthens every position you hold going into court. Nora set both items on the desk beside the recovered medal. She was thinking about the hearing Slade had scheduled, the petition contesting the will on grounds of Gwen's mental incompetence. The challenge she had known was coming since before Willa's first suspicious phone call. She called Dot from the porch. Slade arrived within the hour with her briefcase and her efficient manner and the particular quality of lawyers who have seen enough to remain calm at the sight of a ransacked room. She moved through the evidence of the break-in with her phone camera, documenting methodically. The theft actually helps us, she said, which was not what Nora expected to hear. It establishes that the collection is at genuine risk, which fast-tracks our application for emergency historical preservation status. I filed the initial petition yesterday. With this evidence, she gestured at the broken cases, I can request an expedited hearing. And with the neurological evaluation Willa provided, we have everything we need to counter the competency challenge. Gordon's attorney filed the incompetency petition 2 days ago. The hearing is set for next Thursday. We will counter with the neurological evaluation, with Rex's testimony about Gwen's detailed and consistent management of the collection, with Hartwell's account of her clear and purposeful communications over many years. She paused. We also have a witness I would like you to meet before the hearing. Rex arrived the following morning with a man Nora had not seen before. The stranger moved slowly, supported by a polished wooden cane, his frame reduced by age to something narrow and deliberate, but his eyes, when he turned them on Nora, were entirely present, entirely sharp. Thad Harwick, Rex said. He served with Flint Pennick in Europe. The old man extended a hand that was gnarled but steady. Flint carried me a mile under active fire to reach the aid station at St. Lo in '44, he said. I have spent the 60 years since trying to be worth that effort. He looked past Nora into the cabin. I have been following the news about the collection. I wanted to meet you before I testified. He spent the morning in the underground room with Rex, moving from shelf to shelf with the unhurried attention of a man who recognized old friends. He stopped before the case containing the remaining World War II medals and identified each one without consulting any label, naming the soldier it had belonged to, the action for which it had been awarded, the circumstance by which it had come into Flint's care. That Silver Star, he said, pointing to a medal near the center of the case. That belonged to Lieutenant Carver. He died pulling 3 men out of a burning tank. Flint bought it from his widow in 1962 when she needed money for a medical procedure. He paid twice the market value and recorded it in the ledger as a permanent loan from the Carver family. He never considered it his. He was its custodian. Via had come to stand beside Thad during this account. When he finished, she said, "That is what the registry is for." So the story stays with the thing. Thad looked down at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something close to it. That is exactly right, young lady. That is exactly what it is for. The night before the hearing, after Bea was asleep, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the sealed envelope in front of her. She had been carrying it for days in her jacket pocket and then in her bag, taking it out and looking at it and putting it back. She had told herself she was not ready. She had told herself she needed to understand more of the context before she could read what was inside. But she understood now that she was not waiting for more information. She was waiting for permission that no one living could give her, permission from a man who had been preparing a gift and had run out of time to deliver it. She opened the envelope. 2 pieces of paper. Gwen's letter to Ford, written in the careful script of someone whose hand had grown uncertain with age, but whose intention remained precise. Ford, my dear, the small key in this envelope opens the private compartment in Flint's desk, the bottom drawer, back panel. And I have never shown what is inside to any other person, not to my children, not to anyone. I am showing it to you because in the time we have spent together in this cabin, going through Flint's records and his history, I have seen in you the quality he described as the keeper's eye, the ability to understand that an object is never merely an object. When the time is right, show Nora what you find there. The family story is not complete without it. The second piece of paper was in Ford's handwriting, undated, a single page. Gwen, I will tell her at the end of the month. I only want to be standing beside her when she finds out what her family built. That is all I want. To be there for that moment, I will bring her in October, Ford. October was the month he died. Nora read his words twice and then set the page down very flat on the table, smoothing it with her palm the way you smooth something you want to preserve. He had been planning it. He had been looking forward to it the way you look forward to giving someone something you know they will love. And then a Tuesday morning had intervened with the absolute indifference of accidents. She took the small key from her key ring and went down to the underground room. Flint's desk stood in the corner where it had always stood. The thieves had pulled open the upper drawers and rifled through them, finding only ledgers and documentation. The bottom drawer had been opened and dismissed as empty. Nora pulled it out fully now and pressed on the back panel, feeling for the inconsistency and depth that she had been told to look for. It gave. A small interior space, perhaps 8 inches deep, fitted with a keyhole she had not been able to see until the panel released. She inserted the small key. It turned smoothly, as if it had been recently used. Inside was a leather pouch, closed with a drawstring, and beneath it a thin notebook, unlike any of the others she had found. Its cover plain and unadorned, its size personal rather than archival. She carried both items to the desk surface and sat down. The notebook was Flint's private writing, not the collection ledgers, not the registry, not the historical documentation. His interior voice from the final years of his life when his handwriting had grown unsteady but had not lost its precision. The entry that stopped her was dated 1971. Official histories record the names of generals and the outcomes of battles. They do not record the farm boy from Ohio who gave his last ration bar to a French child or the medic who sang to dying men because he could not do anything else. These are the acts that define what human beings actually are, not the strategies and the politics, but the small choices made under impossible conditions. When the last witness to those choices dies, the choices die with them unless something remains, unless someone keeps something that carries the story forward. That is what this collection is. Not objects, carriers. She sat with the notebook for a long time. Then she opened the leather pouch. Flint's own service medals, which he had never displayed, his military identification tags, the metal worn smooth from decades of handling, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials VP, Veda Pennick, his wife, and at the bottom of the pouch, a silver dollar with a deep gouge cut across its face, the kind of damage that does not come from ordinary wear. A small piece of paper was folded around it. The writing was old, the ink faded but legible. Carried in my breast pocket. June 6, 1944, German bullet, Omaha Beach. The debt I carry for having survived when the men beside me did not. Nora held the coin in her palm and felt its weight, which was not the weight of silver, but the weight of an entire life, organized around a single morning in France. The life of a man who had come home and spent 50 years trying to honor what he owed. She understood now why Gwen had never shown this to anyone. It was not a collection piece. It was not historical documentation. It was Flint Pennick's most private accounting of himself, the thing he kept because he could not put it down. She put the coin and the handkerchief and the identification tags back in the pouch and pulled the drawstring closed. She put the pouch in her jacket pocket, close to where she had been carrying Ford's envelope. Then she climbed the stairs and went to bed for what remained of the night. The courtroom in the Oak Ridge County building was high-ceilinged and wood-paneled, its formality slightly undermined by water stains on the ceiling and a heating system that produced an audible ticking at intervals. Judge Pruitt, who had silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, reviewed the documents before her with the unhurried attention of someone who did not reach conclusions before she had finished reading. Lyle sat at the opposing table with his attorney. He wore a suit that was slightly too formal for the room, the choice of a man who wanted to project a particular kind of authority. He did not look at Nora when she came in. Willa's chair beside him was empty. She had told Nora that morning that she would not be attending. She had also provided a signed written statement, which Dot had entered into the record. Lyle's attorney presented his case efficiently. A former caregiver testified that Gwen had occasionally confused dates and repeated stories. A financial advisor said she had declined investment opportunities in favor of low-yield savings accounts, which he described as inconsistent with sound management of significant assets. The implication, built carefully across both testimonies, was of a woman in cognitive decline making decisions she could not fully comprehend. Dot's cross-examination of the financial advisor was methodical. She asked him to confirm that Gwen had managed her daily affairs independently until 6 months before her death. He confirmed it. She asked whether declining speculative investments was inherently irrational for a 91-year-old woman. He hedged. She asked whether he had ever evaluated the specific assets Gwen was preserving when she declined to redirect her capital. He had not. Dot then entered the neurological evaluation into evidence. The specialist's findings were unambiguous. Gwen Pennick had been fully cognitively intact 9 months before her death, her memory, judgment, and reasoning all assessed as consistent with a woman decades younger. Rex took the stand next and described 15 years of working alongside Gwen in precise and practical terms. Her knowledge of the collection had been exact and current to the end. She had made specific decisions about preservation methods, insurance documentations, and succession planning, all of them coherent and consistent with the decisions she had been making for decades. She had, he said, the most detailed institutional memory of any private collection manager he had encountered in 50 years of working in the field. Then Thad Harwick walked to the witness stand. He moved slowly, the cane clicking on the hardwood floor, and the room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something of genuine weight enters them. He sat down and adjusted himself and looked at the judge without looking at Lyle or Lyle's attorney. "I am not a lawyer," he said. I will not speak to legal matters because I do not know them. I will speak to what I know, which is Flint Pennock and the work he started and what Gwen Pennock spent her life continuing. He described Flint's collection not as a hobby or an investment, but as a moral project. The deliberate preservation of the human dimensions of historical events, the parts that official records discarded. He described watching it grow across decades, watching Gwen take it over from her father with the same seriousness and the same understanding of what it was for. Gwen Pennock did not make confused decisions, he said. She made decisions that other people did not understand, which is a different thing entirely. She understood what that collection was and what would happen to it if it were sold off or divided. She understood it because her father taught her, and he taught her because he recognized in her the capacity to carry it forward. He looked at the judge steadily. I have watched 3 generations of that family keep faith with something that most people would have sold the first time they needed money. There is nothing impaired in that. There is only commitment that the people challenging it do not share. Nora testified last. Lyle's attorney pressed her on the infrequency of her visits to Gwen in the final years. She acknowledged it without apology and explained it in plain terms. 2 jobs, a child to raise alone, a mortgage in arrears. Gwen had known these circumstances and had never suggested that Nora's absence indicated indifference. The attorney asked whether she had been aware of the collection's value before Gwen's death. No, Nora said. Whether she had ever discussed the collection with Gwen. No, she said. Gwen never told me it existed. Then the attorney made the mistake of asking why, in that case, Gwen would choose Nora over her own children. Nora looked at the question for a moment before she answered it. Because she was not choosing between us based on who visited most or who managed finances most aggressively. She was choosing based on who she believed would understand what Flint had built and protect it for the right reasons. She paused. I do not know whether she was correct about me, but I know she was not confused about the choice she was making. Judge Pruitt did not take long. The evidence presented by the petitioner establishes that Gwen Pennock was elderly and occasionally forgetful, which describes most people in their 90s. It does not establish cognitive impairment sufficient to invalidate a legal document. The neurological evaluation entered into evidence confirms her competence was intact until well after the will was signed. Her choices were consistent across many years, well documented, and clearly intentional. The petition is denied. The will stands. Lyle's face in the moment after the ruling was something Nora would remember. Not rage, not grief, but a particular kind of recalibration, the expression of a man rapidly computing what comes next. She crossed the room to him before he could leave. Tell Earl to return what he took, she said quietly. The court has ruled. The collection has emergency preservation status. Every item he removed is now a documented theft of historically protected material. The longer he holds them, the worse it becomes for him. Lyle looked at her for the first time that day. I have no knowledge of any theft. You have complete knowledge of it, she said. You planned it. You gave him the information he needed. The only question now is whether Earl is willing to extend his own legal exposure indefinitely to protect you. She left him standing there. 2 days later, Hartwell called. Earl had reached out to his attorney the previous morning. He was prepared to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. His statement described Lyle's direct involvement in specific terms. The instructions communicated by text message, the list of items to be taken, the name and contact information of the Pittsburgh buyer. But that was not all. When investigators executed a search warrant at Lyle's home office, they had found documents he had apparently not considered worth destroying. A contract, signed 8 months before Gwen's death, between Lyle Pennock as private agent and Oak Ridge Valley Partners as principal. The contract described his role in facilitating the acquisition of specific parcels in the Pine Hollow Valley and specified a commission of 8% of the total purchase price contingent on delivery of clear title. He had been working for the development company while his mother was still alive. He had been positioning himself to profit from her land before she was in the ground. The charges, Hartwell told her, would include conspiracy to commit theft of historically protected property, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud related to the estate proceedings. He was arrested at his office that morning in front of 3 colleagues and a representative from Oak Ridge Valley Partners who had come for a meeting that did not ultimately take place. Nora stood on the porch of the cabin while Hartwell talked and looked at the tree line and felt something that was not precisely satisfaction, because satisfaction requires having wanted something, and she had not wanted any of this. She had wanted her house not to be foreclosed. She had wanted her daughter to have a stable childhood. She had wanted in the way she always wanted it, but had learned not to dwell on, for Ford not to have gone to work on a particular Tuesday morning 2 years ago. None of that had changed, but some of it, at least, had shifted. The partnership agreement with the Pennsylvania Historical Society came through 3 weeks later. The terms preserved the collection at Pine Hollow in its entirety, prohibited dispersal or individual sale of any component piece, and provided an annual conservation stipend sufficient to maintain the property and its contents at professional standards. A modest educational access program, capped at small scheduled groups, would generate additional revenue. The collection would remain what Flint had intended it to be, a coherent archive, not a commodity. Nora used the first disbursement to resolve the foreclosure proceeding on the house in town. She did not move back into it. She and Bea had been living at the cabin for 3 weeks by then, and the house in town had begun to feel, in the way places do when you have left them, like something from a different chapter. She hired a carpenter to fix the sagging porch and replace the broken window in the smaller bedroom. She contacted the telephone company about restoring the landline. She ordered a proper bed for Bee's room to replace the temporary arrangement they had been using. Bee, for her part, had continued her registry. It had started the night of the break-in in the underground archive, with her wobbly copies of coins and medals drawn in her spiral notebook. It had evolved, under Rex's patient guidance, into something more systematic. She learned the proper terms for coin condition grading, not by being taught them formally, but by asking Rex questions every time he came by, which was twice a week now, until the vocabulary became natural. She began writing her own descriptions of individual pieces in language that was not Flint's careful archival prose and not Rex's expert assessment, but something distinctly her own, specific and direct, and occasionally funny in ways that made Rex laugh. One afternoon, Nora came down to the underground room to find Bee sitting at Flint's desk with his oldest journal open beside her and her own notebook open in front of her, working through them side by side. "I am checking my descriptions against his," Bee said without looking up, "to see if I got the story right." Rex, sitting on a wooden stool nearby with his own notes, caught Nora's eye and said nothing. The evening that felt like a conclusion came on an ordinary Wednesday in December. Rex had gone home. Hartwell had made his afternoon pass along Pine Hollow Road and waved from his vehicle. Dot had sent the final confirmation that the preservation agreement was fully executed and recorded. Bea had eaten dinner and done her homework at the kitchen table and gone to bed without complaint, which was unusual enough to feel significant. Nora sat on the porch in the cold, wrapped in a wool blanket she had found in the cedar chest in the second archive, watching the dark come down through the pines. The trees did not move much. There was no wind. The silence was the particular silence of a place that has been quiet for a long time and has no particular relationship with noise. She thought about Flint Pennock sitting on this same porch in 1946 or 1950 or 1963 with whatever he had been carrying from Europe and whatever he was building here in the Pennsylvania woods, the two things existing in him simultaneously, the weight of what he had survived and the purposeful response to that weight. 50 years of deliberate work in a direction that most people around him probably did not fully understand. She thought about Gwen tending that work after him. Driving out to this cabin alone, calling Hartwell to say she was there, spending days in the underground room maintaining what her father had built, adding to the documentation, keeping the systems running, waiting for the right person to hand it to. She thought about Ford sitting at Flint's desk in 2018, reading these same journals, understanding what he was reading, planning to bring her here in October. The leather pouch was in her jacket pocket, where it had been since the night she opened the desk compartment. She took it out now and held it in both hands with opening it. The weight of it was familiar by now. The outline of the coin through the leather was familiar. She had taken it out and held it many times in the past few weeks, not to examine it, but for the same reason Flint had carried it in his breast pocket across an entire war, because some things anchor you when you need anchoring. She put it back and sat for a while longer. Then the door behind her opened and Bea came out in her pajamas and her wool socks, carrying her spiral notebook and a flashlight. "I could not sleep," she said. "Come sit with me." Bea settled into the adjacent chair and pulled a section of Nora's blanket over her legs. She opened her notebook to the page she had been working on that evening, a description of the Lincoln campaign button, and read it back to herself in a low voice, making small corrections with her pencil. Nora listened to the scratch of the pencil and the distant sound of something moving in the trees at the property's edge, an animal going about its own business in the dark. Mom, Bea said, still writing, when I get older, can I keep doing this? Nora looked at her daughter's profile in the cold air, the concentration on her face, the pencil moving steadily. Yes, she said, that is exactly the idea. Bea nodded and kept writing. Above them, the winter stars were out, clear and numerous the way they only get far from town, and the cabin behind them held what it had always held, the accumulated weight of deliberate human memory, waiting to be carried forward by whoever understood what it was for and was willing to do the work.